Welcome, welcome, welcome to our ESU Happy Hour sponsored by the New Orleans branch Creole Food, America's Oldest Cuisine. I'm Director of Branch Services, Joshua Kevo Gonzalez, and I want to thank everyone for being with us today. Before we get started, I wanted to make a quick couple of announcements. After the presentation, we'll be holding a question and answer session. And now you can answer your questions into either the Q&A or chat module simply by typing them in. Buttons to access both of these are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can do this at any point during the presentation. It doesn't have to be during the Q&A portion. We will get to questions in the order received. Additionally, I want to thank the Central Florida, Atlanta, and of course the New Orleans branch for being the top 3 branches in terms of members who registered for today's happy hour. Now, to start us off, I'd like to welcome the president of the New Orleans branch, Dave Grissett. Dave?
Thank you, Josh, and a happy Mardi Gras welcome to this English-speaking union happy hour. We all hope all out there continue to be healthy and safe in these challenging times. I'm David Grissett, president of the New Orleans branch. Carnival is underway here in New Orleans, as you may know, notwithstanding COVID. So I'm wearing a different kind of mask today, at least around the house. All bars have been closed and all traditional parades and balls have been canceled for Mardi Gras for the first time since World War II. However, the creative and spirited citizens of New Orleans are undeterred and have turned their homes into house floats like you see behind me in this photo. They are stationary versions of the usual ornately decorated parades that typically roll through the city streets during carnival time. In addition, some carnival crews have generously put their most prized historic floats on view in City Park for drive-by viewing. As always, king cakes are being enjoyed as well as shipped out around the country and to the world to friends and family. Cheers on that. And virtual and socially distant Yardi Gras parties have replaced the traditional parade route parties. So we want to celebrate Mardi Gras with you by sharing the history of our famous New Orleans Creole cuisine, which is, as our speaker will tell you, different than the neighboring Cajun cuisine. In New Orleans, before we have a delicious Creole meal, we often enjoy the official cocktail of New Orleans, the Sazerac, which is today's featured cocktail and is hopefully in your hand right now. Apparently, Sazerac cognac bars were the Smoothie King franchise of the American colonial days, as there were some 16 of them up and down the East Coast port cities by the mid-19th century. However, the unique New Orleans cocktail version dates back to 1851. Its creator, Aaron Bird, owner of the mercantile, quote, coffee, unquote, house, mixed the French Sazerac de Forge et Fille cognac with bitters and absinthe. The bitters were produced by local apothecary owner Antoine Amédée Péchaud, hence the name Peychaud bitters used today. He was a Creole migrant from the West Indies. Well, as it happens, history won't even let a good cocktail be. Phylloxera killed the grapevines in France in the late 19th century that produced the Sazerac cognac, and the green fairy of absinthe was banned in the USA from 1912 until 2007 out of unfounded fears of the psychotic effects of its wormwood component. Adroitly, the New Orleans Sazerac House Bar made a replacement mix of rye whiskey and herb saint, and that mix is still in use today. The original Mercantile Coffee House, which had been renamed that Sazerac House, became a museum in 2019, and the luxurious Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans has also been home to the well-known Sazerac Bar for over 100 years of its existence. So if you have them in hand, cheers and enjoy. Our speaker, Liz Williams, is a native of New Orleans and is of Sicilian descent. She is married to attorney Rick Normand, who serves on our board of our local branch. They are the proud parents of two sons, Eric Normand, an author and father of two daughters, and comedian Mark Normand, based in New York City. Liz obtained her Bachelor of Arts in English and then a Juris Doctorate from Louisiana State University. She practiced law in Washington, D.C. and Louisiana for almost 2 decades. She has held a variety of teaching positions at notable institutions throughout the country, including the University of Maryland, Tulane University, and New York University. She has also served as a culinary diplomatic consultant, both nationally and internationally in Colombia and Russia and France. Liz grew up with an appreciation of diverse cultural influences. Having experienced cuisine that was derived from 2 strong culinary traditions, fascinated by the way the lure of nutmeg and peppercorns motivated the exploration of the world, she became determined to integrate her love of food and history. She was amazed that the South did not have a museum dedicated to its extraordinary and unique gastronomic backgrounds. So in 2004, she assembled a team and the resources which led to the development of the concept now known as the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, SOFAB, which it is, located in the New Orleans Central City District. Since then, under her direction, SOFAB has celebrated the rich history of food and drink of the South via a variety of exhibitions from each Southern state, educational programs, test kitchen demonstrations, and food events. The museum has received critical acclaim from across the globe, including being named one of the 11 of the world's top food museums by CNN and one of the 12 best museums around the world by Elle Decor. She also founded, under the National Food and Beverage umbrella, the Museum of the American Cocktail, so fun, MOTAC, and the John and Bonnie Boyd Hospitality and Culinary Library in New Orleans. I should also mention that the Boyds happen to be ESU national patron members of our branch. Then, as well as affiliate museums, the Pacific Food and Beverage Museum and the West Coast arm of MOTAC, both located in Los Angeles. Liz is a prolific author and contributor to over a dozen publications, which are in her CV linked to the registration for this event. She also hosts a weekly podcast, Tip of the Tongue, exploring the intersection of food and drink and culture. Liz frequently serves as a judge for food festivals throughout the US and consults on issues of nonprofit management and governance, as well as public and private partnerships, intellectual property, and publishing. So without further ado, our distinguished speaker, Liz Williams.
Thank you so much, Dave. And thank you to the ESU, to Julie and Josh and Karen for inviting me. This is really exciting, and it's always my pleasure to talk about food and drink in New Orleans. And so thanks for giving me that opportunity. And Dave, I will raise my Sazerac and say thank you to you. Now, I might as well have a sip of it, right? So I think that it's a really bold statement to talk about New Orleans as, and Creole food as, the oldest cuisine of America. But I really think that it is. And really the question of isn't so much why is it or is there, it's just how did it come to be? And that became a sort of quest of mine. In 2004, when we really started to put together the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, it became really important to be able to explain things in an exhibit arrangement. And so you have to have the answer to these questions. And not only do you have to be able to show the things in artifact form, but you have to also have them tell a real story. So there are lots and lots of great food cities in the United States. New York, San Francisco come immediately to mind. And if you want to talk about New York, just think you can eat in the whole world in New York. And you can find every kind of really authentic restaurant that's there. But there is no identifiable New York cuisine. You might be able to argue that you can eat New York style pizza or maybe a New York style clam chowder, but people tend to keep their ethnic identities in New York, which is a wonderful trait of the city, and it makes for really wonderful eating, but it doesn't give you a cuisine. So really, I started to look at things in order to make the Southern Food and Beverage Museum exhibit make sense. So in order to do that, and I think, Josh, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in order to go to this question, the question was, how is it that a cuisine actually developed in New Orleans? And in order to look at that, you have to decide whether there really is such a thing as a cuisine, and how are you going to argue what that is? Cookbooks, which was the first place to look, in their introductions talked about all of the ethnic groups that came together in New Orleans and how magically their cuisines melded, and kind of in abracadabra fashion, you found that there was a cuisine. This was obviously not a very rigorous kind of scientific research project to figure out how a cuisine came about that was published in these cookbooks. And it was also possible to find historic references to various dishes and statements attesting to the fact that the food of New Orleans was very special, even in the 18th century when people wrote about their travels. But I could not find an overall explanation of why a cuisine developed in New Orleans. And I also knew that in the South, the same ethnic groups had come together again and again, and yet you still didn't find that there was a developed cuisine. So let's agree that we need to explore this a little bit. So we wanted to figure out, what is a cuisine? So there was a noted anthropologist, Sidney Mintz, who talked a lot about the anthropology of food. And in one of his books, Tasting Food, Tasting Freedom, he gave a three-part explanation of what a cuisine is. So first of all, the thing that was important is that everyone eats it. That is a very important element of cuisine. And Josh, I think we can go to that slide now. Thank you. Everyone eats it. Now, the reason this is important is that we may be familiar with the phrase high on the hog. And high on the hog talks about eating high on the animal. And the higher you are on the animal up to the shoulders, the better the eating, the richer you are, the more status you have. And the lower you eat, so that you're eating the pig's feet, the more you are at the lowest end of the status rung, of the status ladder. So if you eat that way, if there's a certain cuisine or there's certain food that's eaten by the lowest people, the people of lowest status, and a different cuisine eaten by the people of the highest status, then you don't have a universal cuisine for that location. So it's really important to note that in New Orleans, everyone eats the same food. That means that red beans and rice, which would be considered in some places the food of poverty, would be eaten by even the people at the highest social rung. So in New Orleans, we qualify when we say that everyone eats the food. So the second aspect is that it becomes part of people's identity. Now, this is really also important because everyone believes in the cuisine. It is something that I think we really came to see in the most recent past during Hurricane Katrina, when people would write to me at the museum, because we had a website at that time. Remember, Hurricane Katrina happened in 2005, and people were spread out in almost a diaspora around the country. People would write to me and say, I'm living in Des Moines, or I'm living in San Francisco, or whatever, and I can't find the right brand of red beans to make my red beans and rice. Or I can't find filet to make my gumbo. Or I can't find coffee and chicory. Can you help me find these foods so that I can feel whole, that I can feel that my identity hasn't been taken away from me, because these foods are very important. It really made me see how important those foods were, because I was lucky enough to be living in Mississippi during the diaspora. And so it wasn't hard for me to get the foods I was looking for. But people who wound up on the Pacific coast, who wound up in New England and or someplace in some place like Michigan or whatever, they really did have trouble finding these foods. So I think we can say that it is definitely a part of people's identity. There's a wonderful apocryphal story about people in Houston. They were at a big shelter in Houston, and various church groups had gotten together to bring food to the shelter so that the people could eat it. And apparently the coffee was terrible and the food was just kind of ordinary. And so nobody would eat the food. And some people were going away with food that they thought these hundreds of people in the shelter should have finished all of this food. And so finally, some representative of the refugees at the shelter said, why don't you just give us the raw ingredients and let us cook it ourselves? Because first of all, we don't have anything to do here, but second of all, it'll be much better. So that is how much a part of people's identity it was, that they had to fix their own food, even living in the shelter. And then finally, everyone recognizes it. So how do we know what this means? This means that if you gave me food, even though it wasn't something that I knew, that I would recognize it. For example, I remember growing up, I would go to people's homes for dinner. Friends of mine would invite me, and I recognized gumbo wherever I got it. And I knew, because of this experience, that everybody's gumbo was different. They put different ingredients in it. They cooked it at different lengths of time. It was always different from place to place, but I always knew it was gumbo. And one of the things that I have learned is that people who are related to people from New Orleans, let's say a family from New Orleans moves to Denver, and they don't eat New Orleans food every day, but when they have a special occasion, whether it's a holiday or it's somebody's birthday or some other reason to celebrate, they'll cook the food of New Orleans. So if you're a child growing up in that home, when you eat your gumbo, that gumbo is the same every time you eat it, because the only gumbo you're exposed to is your parents' gumbo. If you come to New Orleans, and I've experienced this more than once, people will say, this gumbo isn't right. It's not gumbo. My mother does this or that with the gumbo. And you have to explain to them that they're never going to find their mother's gumbo in New Orleans because she's not here. However, it's still gumbo, and that there's not just one recipe for gumbo. And that ability for someone who lives here to recognize someone else's food as being right, being the right flavor profile and whatever, that's something that is an important element of having a cuisine. So a friend of mine and I did an experiment. You know how it is when you go to do something in an office building and you have to ride in the elevator, everyone faces the door of the elevator. So if you're in the back, you're actually looking at the back of somebody's head, and nobody really talks in the elevator. But she and I had a kind of a plan, and we would talk to each other and say, oh, I think the best roast beef po' boy in New Orleans is at such and such a place. And then we would have this fake argument about where the best po' boy was in New Orleans. And pretty soon, everybody in the elevator would be contributing the place that they thought was the best roast beef po' boy. Nobody held back. No one paid any attention to elevator protocol. Everybody talked about it. People would ride to the wrong floor just to have a chance to tell their story. It was really great. And we did this for about 2 hours, riding up and down in the elevator. And it didn't matter whether it was the janitor who was going from floor to floor with a mop. That person would still feel absolutely entitled to tell us what he thought, and that we would listen, which of course we did, because everyone recognizes it, everybody knows it, and everybody identifies it. So based on that, we would say that we have a cuisine in New Orleans. Now, why is there a cuisine in New Orleans? We've established that one exists. So let's talk about New Orleans. New Orleans was founded in 1718. So this was basically in the middle of the Enlightenment. When we study the Enlightenment in school, we mostly study the English Enlightenment. It was the English Enlightenment that brought us the American Revolution. It was reading all of that material. And of course, because it's written in English, it's a lot easier for us to study directly the writings of the English Enlightenment. When you read about it and you know about it, it is also true that the colonies, the English colonies, were the ones that were being most influenced by the English Enlightenment. So it's something that really did lead to our American Revolution. The Enlightenment was a time in the 17th and 18th centuries when reason and logic were applied to government. They were applied to science, especially in the English Enlightenment. So you had Darwin, you had a sense of freedom, egalitarianism, tolerance, all sorts of things that we value today. But one thing that they didn't do in the English Enlightenment, was to apply rationality and reason to the arts. And so because of that, we had a little bit of a difference between the English Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. Now, when we are studying about the early part of America, obviously we're talking about the relationship with England. But at the time in the 18th century that the colonies were developing, we also had what was going on in France. So Josh, let's look at the picture of the French Enlightenment. Thank you. So in France, once again, there was an enlightenment that was going on. But that enlightenment not only was about government, and of course led to a very bloody revolution, but it also was about the senses and a belief that you must logically believe in the senses. And the senses were applied to the arts. And one of the arts was culinary art. And so you had it then in the 17th and 18th century, the idea that food was an art. So there was an art to eating, and then because of this logic, there was a corresponding art of cooking. I think that the French really made the food and music kind of correspond to each other. It's a little bit different from literature or the visual arts, because there you have one person who is creating the art and it becomes fixed in one form, either in the form of a painting or a drawing or in the form of a book. In music, it's being performed and it's being listened to, but it isn't fixed. I mean, today we can fix it, but when you first had it, it wasn't fixed. And similarly, you prepare food and then you eat it and it's gone. So that consumption of food was like the consumption of music. It was ephemeral and it was gone. But you needed both sides, the side that makes it and the side that appreciates it, for it to be balanced and for it to be logical. The other thing that was really different was that in France, during this period, the restaurant was developing, and then finally haute cuisine was developing. Now, the haute cuisine continued to develop into the 19th century, but in the 18th century were its beginnings. So the people who came to New Orleans, to La Nouvelle Orleans and to La Louisiane, those people brought with them these seeds of the Enlightenment. They were there a little bit later than some of the English colonies were, but nevertheless, they were bringing with them what was happening in France, not what was necessarily happening in England. Now, as I said, when we study it, we're thinking about what's going on in the English colonies. Another thing that was different, and which I think is very important, is that in England, you had England and you had the colonies. So you knew that you weren't in England anymore. And so there was a great desire on the part of the colonists to remain English, especially in the beginning. So they wanted to dress like English people, they wanted to eat and behave and be like English people. It was a little bit different in New Orleans because the French didn't observe New Orleans as a colony. They observed New Orleans just as they observed New France in Canada. That was an extension of France. And so you were in France when you were in New Orleans, just as much as you would be if you were in Paris. Obviously, there was a difference, but it was intellectually the same place. And so, whereas in the English colonies, the food might be different than what you might eat in England. So you were eating colonial food. But in New Orleans, even if you were eating different food, you might have been eating an alligator. It was a French alligator. And so you were still eating French food. So New Orleans was founded with the idea that you were eating in France, that what you were eating was French. And no matter who came here, to New Orleans, it became French. And so that really made a big difference. You overlay onto that the idea that food was an art form, and with communications with France, where the food there and the restaurant industry and whatever was actually developing, you had a very, very different attitude about food in New Orleans than you did in the English colonies. So I think that that is very, very important. So let's talk about gumbo. One of the things that is important to say about gumbo is that it is probably the food that best identifies and personifies the food of New Orleans. Now, when I talk about Creole cuisine, I am talking about the food of New Orleans. And that is something that people could argue about. What does it really mean to be Creole or anything like that? When do you stop saying that something is Creole? I'm not really going to go down that path. When we talk about Creole food, we are talking about the food of New Orleans. So let's talk about gumbo. Gumbo is a kind of a thick soup that we eat, usually served with rice. There are 3 traditional thickeners for gumbo. And if you look at really old recipes as opposed to modern recipes, you will be able to sort them by the time of year that they would have been made and what they represent in terms of seasonality and availability of various foods. So the 3 thickeners represent the 3 continents that basically spawned the food of New Orleans. So you have Native American, you have American food, and that is filet. So filet was a thickener that was used by the native people. It is made from the dried leaves of the sassafras tree, and the sassafras tree is native to the Americas. So it was possible during some times of the year to actually just pull the leaves down and grind them in your hand and let them fall into the pot. At other times, the leaves were collected and dried and then ground, and they would be used as a thickener. It also lends a flavor to the gumbo, which is particularly notable. And so it's not just a thickener, it also is a flavor enhancer. And it's something that is still used today. And it's called filet because when you heat it, it makes little strings of kind of gelatinous material. And the French called it filet. Another thickener is okra. So okra as a thickener was the representation from Africa. So okra was a plant that was brought over to the New World. It's kind of not known exactly exactly how it got here. We believe it was partially brought by the slave traders because they wanted to have a food that was going to be eaten by the enslaved people. And so they ate okra on their way here. Sometimes they swallowed okra seeds. And okra happened to grow well in the New Orleans area. And so it was something that people could continue to plant, and it became one of the foods of New Orleans. So okra also can thicken, and it was seasonally available at the same time as crabs and shrimp were running in the lake. And so it was very traditional to put okra, tomatoes, shrimp, and crabs together into a seafood gumbo. And then finally, there is another, and of course, okra has a flavor. the final food gumbo, the thickener, is the roux. So a roux is a thickener made out of flour, wheat flour. So of course, there was no wheat in America before the Europeans brought it here. And so wheat was not something that grew, especially in the early days, in and around New Orleans. And so it was something that was very scarce. So people weren't using a roux to thicken their gumbo unless they had nothing else to thicken it with. But when they did use it, they did make it into a brown roux, and they would actually toast the flour in the oil. Now that oil could have been duck fat, it could have been bear fat, it could have been pig lard or pig fat. So it didn't have to be, say, a classical roux, which it would be today, which would be butter and flour. And it would have been toasted, as I say, not just to kill the raw flour flavor, but to actually develop the flavor, that toasted flavor. And it would be thick, it would be a thickener, but it would not thicken as much as a white flour blonde roux does today, because you toast out some of the thickening power as you make it darker. But those three thickeners represent the various continents that really contributed to our food. So we were French, and then we were Spanish. And when the Spanish came, they brought something else to the food of New Orleans. So it was mostly cooked by the enslaved Africans, but the Spanish brought with them a desire to eat rice. And so rice was something that was more highly developed during the time that the Spanish were governing New Orleans. They didn't have the amount of influence that they could have because they didn't see New Orleans as a valuable place. We were simply the physical buffer between the English colonies to the east and their very lucrative Mexico, Texas colony to their west, to the west of New Orleans. So we were just a physical buffer. But nevertheless, they did, as I say, enjoy rice, and they brought in Africans who were still enslaved, but who, because they were in the part of Africa where rice was grown, had the technology and the skill to actually grow the rice. And so rice began to more and more become a crop that was grown in Louisiana, outside of New Orleans. Another thing that they did was they brought some sanitation to the city. The French market that you've probably heard of, one of the oldest markets in the United States, that market was not ever covered until the Spanish were here. Before that, it was just goods spread out on the bank of the river at the certain bend where the French market is today. But it was built on the river so that the tide of the river would take away whatever was the detritus left from the market. And the Spanish found that to be very unsanitary, and so they changed those rules. Another thing that the Spanish did, which is very important to the culture of New Orleans, is that they began to actually auction off tavern licenses. And when they did that, it meant that there would be more money to run the city. So people not only paid a lot of money to get a tavern license, then the actual amount of alcohol that they sold was also taxed. So all this tax money was money that was used to run the city. And so therefore, there was a great desire for people to drink a lot. And if you ever read anything about people who were drinking at unlicensed places, it wasn't that this was some sort of immoral thing. because they thought those people shouldn't be drinking outside of the city or whatever. It was merely that they were annoyed that they weren't getting tax money from those places. So it was really an important element of encouraging people in New Orleans to drink, which of course we still do today. So as I say, the Spanish were very important. And then finally, one of the things that they did was they brought spices and the use of spices to our cuisine. So I would say that those were the Spanish people's biggest contributions. All right, so then let's talk about the Louisiana Purchase. So we finished now the 18th century, and in 1803, just the beginning of the 19th century, we have America, which is already a country, and Jefferson is the president. You have Napoleon, who is looking for money to fight his wars and to create his empire. And he decides to sell Louisiana to Jefferson. Now, this is something that just the year before there had been other kinds of things that happened that made the people who had been French, then Spanish, think that they were French again. And so they were very annoyed that they became Americans overnight without having any consent at all. At the time, the people in New Orleans thought that the Americans were basically barbarians. The people of America were interested in money, they were mercantile, they weren't interested in culture, and they spoke this horrible language that was English, and so they were not interested in them at all. The port of New Orleans was becoming more and more useful. Coffee was coming in as it was being grown in the Caribbean and in Central America. There were certain kinds of fruits that were being brought in. Tropical fruits were beginning to be brought in through the port of New Orleans. And the port was also being used by the Americans to export things outside of the colonies or outside of America. And so the people of New Orleans were beginning to see Americans come. But after the Louisiana Purchase, it was this huge, huge influx of Americans into New Orleans. Now, what that meant was many, many things, but one of the important things was that all these foodstuffs came into New Orleans that had not been coming in before. Things from all over America that were being brought here through the waterways to New Orleans. So New Orleanians had to adjust to the fact that people from America were moving to New Orleans. And then by 1812, New Orleans or Louisiana had become a state. So you had this vast Louisiana Purchase, and then the state of Louisiana, which included New Orleans, became a state in 1812. Now, once you have these things in place, now you had Germans who were here. You had the whole Mississippi River that was really turning into a great highway, and that highway meant that there were imports and exports going both ways, and it was changing the food very much and introducing the rest of America to the food of New Orleans. So if you read anything from that time, whether you're reading Mark Twain in his early days when he first became a riverboat pilot, or you're learning other things, whether it's Jean Lafitte or whoever it is you're reading about or who might be writing, you learn that the food of New Orleans, as people come to visit it, is something that is different from what they knew, and so it starts to change, and more the food of New Orleans becomes influenced by the new things that are being brought to it. And then as immigrants come in the 19th century, like the Sicilians, as other immigrants have come through in the 20th century, like the Vietnamese, the food continues and continues to change. And yet it still remains a cuisine. And the thing that I think is the most important about this is that because of these changes, the city remains and the food remains vibrant and alive. So it hasn't become ossified. And we keep changing and opening ourselves to the food that keeps coming through. So let's talk a little bit about the other immigrants. So we have immigrants that we just talked about, the Sicilians. We had Filipinos who came after the emancipation of the enslaved Africans. There was this pull to bring Sicilians in because Sicilians grew sugar on the island of Sicily. So you would be able to have people who had knowledge of the growing of sugar. They came in such numbers that the food began to change. They brought with them all kinds of things that we know of today as kind of Italian American food. They brought pasta. They brought the use of eggplants, and they took foods that were already here, like eggplant and artichokes, and they turned them into something else. One of the things that I think is really ironic is that tomatoes, which are native to the Americas, grew well in Sicily, and they began to be canned in Sicily. So that in Sicily, they were eating canned tomatoes, and they brought the practice of eating canned tomatoes back to America. There were Filipinos who began to dry shrimp and ferment them. And so that dried and fermented shrimp is often used in our gumbo today. The Vietnamese have changed the food of New Orleans, and the connection that they had with the French has been a wonderful marriage, so that banh mi, which are kind of sandwiches made with a Vietnamese sensibility on French bread, have melded with the po' boys in New Orleans so that you have something really different. Since post-Katrina times, we've had many immigrants from Latin America. First, they started out being mostly Mexican, but then came from other parts of Latin America to rebuild the city. And so now you can get oyster tacos and all kinds of things that are totally non-traditional, but that are adaptations of the food of New Orleans. So let's talk a little bit about individuals, and then we'll talk quickly about tourism, and then I'm going to stop talking because I'm just going on and on. So individuals have been very important in both telling the story of New Orleans food to itself, because of course, if you grow up here, it's just food. It's not New Orleans food, it's just food. You think all food is like this. But Lafcadio Hearn in the late 19th century, who was a journalist, came to call it Creole food. He's actually the first person who named it. And once you name it, then you can talk about it. And that's what began to happen. And he kind of introduced the rest of the world to the food of New Orleans. During the WPA in the 20th century, there was a great book for tourists that was written. And one of the things they said in this book was that the food of New Orleans is just as important to experience as its architecture and its cathedrals, and the food is actually worth the visit. In 1884, there was the World Exposition in New Orleans, and a book called La Cuisine Creole, written by Lafcadio Hearn, was published, and people took away with them this recipe book of the food of New Orleans, and that began to bring New Orleans out into the world. Al Copeland, who started Popeyes, has been a great ambassador of the flavor profile of New Orleans, bringing the food of New Orleans, whether it's red beans and rice or dirty rice or fried chicken to biscuits and cornbread to other parts of the country. And then you have Leah Chase, who you see here, who is called the Queen of Creole Cuisine. Also Paul Prudhomme, who was a Cajun man who worked at Commander's Palace and really, because of his television shows and whatever, was able to be an ambassador for New Orleans. And then Emeril Lagasse, who's not even from Louisiana, also became very well known through Commander's Palace. He was a protege of Paul Prudhomme, and he also has been an ambassador for the food of New Orleans. So you can't, in tourism, you will find that New Orleans really sells its food. In the 1950s, there was a Chamber of Commerce decision that food would be one of the selling points of the city. And so it's certainly possible that you could turn the food into something that's so commercial that it loses its authenticity. But I would tell you that nowhere else are you going to find the food like the food in New Orleans, because the people here care so much about the food that they won't let it become so commercialized that you lose the value of it. So our food is not French. It is not African. It is not anything. It is the food of New Orleans. So I want to thank you for listening to me talk about food, my favorite subject. And I really am open to any questions that you might have.
So thank you very much, Liz, for that presentation. That was wonderful. And I hope my slide transitions weren't too off at times.
No, they were fun.
So we do have a couple of questions that have come in already, but as Liz said, if you have any questions, and I said previously, please enter them in, type them into either the chat box or the Q&A box. We'll get to them in the order received, but we already have one, which is the food of New Orleans different in restaurants?
Oh, well, I would have to say yes, it is. But that doesn't mean that it isn't right. But, you know, I think always the food that you eat at home is going to be different than what you're going to find in restaurants. There are several kinds of restaurants. There are restaurants that really serve home style food. And I think that that those are abundant, and it's very possible to eat food that tastes very, very much like you would eat at home. But I think if you go to a restaurant where there's a certain elevation, kind of chefiness, we'll call it, that can happen. It's not that the food isn't based on home cooking, but it is a little bit different, perhaps more stylized than you would perhaps fix at home.
Okay, so a lot of questions have poured in the time it took you to answer that. So as you study Southern food broadly, have you noted any culinary similarities to that of Key West, which strikes me as a small New Orleans in many respects?
Well, I think that the use of seafood is something similar to what happens at Key West, but I don't think that there is as much African influence on the food of Key West. There's Caribbean influence, but not directly African. So I would say that it's not exactly the same, but obviously if you're cooking seafood and it's fresh the way it is in Key West, it's pretty nice.
I'm actually going to segue a question into there that I think is related, is what place would you say seafood has in Creole cooking?
I would say that it has a very, very important place in Creole cooking. We eat many, many fin fishes, and we're so close to the Gulf of Mexico that it's virtually impossible not to be aware of so many of the fin fishes. You know, and we eat little fishes that have lots of bones at home and fry them whole and all that kind of stuff. The kind of things that you wouldn't necessarily do in a restaurant where people want a fillet or whatever. We eat all kinds of, well, we eat oysters, we eat clams, all of which are native. And we have different kinds of shrimp, and we eat those shrimp at different times when they're running. We have the brackish water of Lake Pontchartrain, which is a really wonderful place for a lot of young seafood to spawn before it goes out into the Gulf. So we eat lots and lots of seafood, and I think it's very important. And we do say that friends won't let friends eat frozen food, frozen seafood.
So our next question comes from Catherine Ladinier, who asks, can you discuss Lala, the Creole migration from NOLA to Los Angeles, and Creole influences in Los Angeles?
Okay, so I think that that's a really very interesting and important phenomenon. So it really came up to a great extent because of the extension of the railroad, and it became something where people of color who could get good jobs on the railroad, like on the Pullman cars and the other food cars, and were porters and whatever on the railroad, sometimes lived in Los Angeles, especially to escape the Jim Crow South. But still were going back and forth between Los Angeles and New Orleans. Their families grew up then in Los Angeles, but came back often when they had privileges on the train, and so they could go back and forth. I love the idea that in barbershops and such in Los Angeles, there would be a day, like always Mondays, they would have red beans and rice in the barbershop, and everyone from New Orleans would only go on Mondays, you know, to get their hair cut and things like that. And there are still families there who cook Creole food, and they get it right because they've had enough exposure to real New Orleans cooking. So yeah, it's very fascinating phenomenon.
So the next question comes from Lisa Slatton, who asks, could you distinguish between Creole and Cajun food?
Okay. New Orleans food is Creole food, okay? Cajun food came about in a totally different way. So there was a group of people who were in New France, which was in Canada, and they were basically ousted by the English, and there was a great migration, which was called the Grand Dérangement. This happened in sort of the middle of the 18th century, and some of those people went back to France, some of them went to the Caribbean, some of them came to Louisiana. They were living a subsistence kind of life in Canada, and they lived kind of isolated and simply, and they did not move to New Orleans. They settled in the areas outside of New Orleans, west of New Orleans, and they were the people of Acadiana, and they were the Acadians because that's what they were called, and that came to be known as Cajun. It is much simpler food it's delicious. So I'm not saying that isn't good because I'm calling it simple, but there would often be one pot dishes because the people only had one pot and they lived really in an isolated way. So that it wasn't easy to get another pot. Also without a lot of seasonings. I mean, it was a salt and pepper kind of cooking. Maybe you could grow your own peppers that would give some hotness to something, but that was really all there was. And so if you look at really early Cajun food, not Cajun food of today, but if you look at really early Cajun food, it was very simple. Simple crawfish etouffee was some kind of a fat and crawfish cooked slowly and then served over rice. I mean, it was very simple. And it wasn't influenced by as many things, and there wasn't as much access as there to other things that you couldn't grow yourself or hunt.
So our next question is from Sharon Merriman, who asks, have the oyster beds recovered?
So I don't think that they have fully recovered. I think that it takes years for the beds to really grow back again. So I think they're on their way and I think they're being tended, but no, they haven't fully recovered.
So Brian Decker with a two-part question here, in that, can you share any Creole recipes? Maybe not right now, perhaps. And are there any great Creole restaurants in New York City?
So I will say that I do not know of a great Creole restaurant in New York City. And if you know of one, I wish you would tell me because I would very much like to know. I know of places like Two Boots and whatever, where, it's like the boot of Italy and the boot of Louisiana and things like that. But that becomes a pizza restaurant, So I don't know of a great Creole restaurant. Recipes, oh, there's so many great cookbooks that were written by people who really know what they're doing. I would just recommend that you get a really good cookbook.
So our next question is from Ann McMullen, who asks, do you recommend any specific restaurants for a first trip to New Orleans?
Oh, I could definitely do that. So I think that Dookie Chase is a really excellent restaurant. And if you go during lunchtime and you can get their buffet, it's one of those all-you-can-eat buffets, but it's nice. You can taste a bunch of things all at the same time, and I think it's a definitely very traditional Creole restaurant. Their white beans and shrimp is just unbelievably good. So that would be a place that I would definitely recommend. And then some of it is going to depend on, what you like and what you're in the mood for. I could recommend a good po' boy place. I could recommend, a fine dining place. There just lots and lots of choices. So some of it just depends on what you're looking for.
All right, so our next question, actually from the chair of the Happy Hour Committee, Karen Blair Brand, who asks, what is the hottest spice used in Creole foods?
So really, I would say that the hottest spice would be cayenne. We don't use all of those Texas peppers or anything like that usually. And people individually might use something like that, but I wouldn't say that it's part of our normal canon. So it's really not that hot. But we use interesting combinations of spices, and I think that's the thing that's so special. In a really interesting Creole seasoning mix, you'll have cayenne, paprika, an undertone, a slight little bit of clove, maybe a little bit of actual oregano and thyme, black pepper, those would be all the kinds of things you would actually put into a mix. But people are always surprised that you would have clove. We cook our crab and our crab boil mixed with coriander and cloves and cardamom. And people are always surprised with mustard seeds, all of that together. It's always a surprise that we will put, and this is very much from the Spanish and the Arab influence on the Spanish, we put sweet spices or traditional sweet spices with other herbs that in savory foods.
So the next question from Dave Grissett, the president of New Orleans, who says, well, great talk, but can you tell us a bit about beverages too, such as Café Brûlot, etc.?
Sure. So Café Brûlot was, it is claimed by Antoine's. Antoine's is the oldest restaurant that it has continuously operated in the United States or in America. It opened in 1849, and it's really was very French, and it was owned by French people. And the son of Antoine, Alciator, Jules, went back to France to train. And when he came back, he brought back with him the idea of flaming drinks, which were all the rage in France at the time. And so he put together this flaming coffee drink that he called Café Brûlot Diabolique. And it used coffee and chicory, which was obviously New Orleans, and had cloves and orange and lemon peel and cognac, which sets on fire, and cinnamon sticks. Very delicious.
So I think our last question is a rather lengthy one, so I'll try to get everything in. But other early French settlements on the west side of the Mississippi had the same history of early settlers and influences: African, Spanish. Examples: St. Louis, St. Geneviève, Cape Girardeau. Certainly the access to crawdad, shrimp were greater in NOLA. Is that why New Orleans food developed such a distinct culture? But these northern settlements had the wheat needed for beignets, etc. Can you address these issues?
So I believe that part of the reason, I mean, even though they were French, they were not, they didn't have as much exposure to as much to eat. In other words, yes, all of the seafood that was available, the foods of Latin America, the Caribbean, all of that wasn't necessarily available. And they were just much smaller. I think that those are all elements of part of the problem. And they didn't have as many other elements. They had African, they had French, they had Native people, but then you started to bring in the Germans who came and all the other people who all settled together. I just think that they didn't have quite the number of people that you might need in order to make that cuisine develop. And they were much closer to America than we were in New Orleans. And I think that makes a difference too.
Excellent. Well, thank you for taking the time to answer all those questions and for the fascinating presentation. I'm now going to introduce the Executive Director of the English Speaking Union, Karen Karpovich. Karen?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Liz, and thank Dave. This was a great afternoon. I mean, I feel like I've been to New Orleans. I mean, from Dave's Mass to the decorated homes in New Orleans, what everybody's trying to do to make the best of the situation that we're in. But it makes us inspired to know where to go when we first start to travel. And New Orleans sounds like a great place to be. Thank you so much, Liz. I mean, food, like language, is always evolving and changing, and your knowledge of it and the journey that you took us through was really appreciated. Thank you so much, and come back again. So I just want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank the Happy Hour Committee chaired by Karen Blair-Brand for putting these together. Again, these are programs that are totally curated by our branches, bringing a little flavor from where we are in the country and what our branches represent. So thank you all. I also hope that I see you 2 weeks from now on the 24th of February, when we'll be taking a little different trip and we'll be hearing about George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. In the meantime, if you're a member, thank you so much for your membership. If you're not, please consider becoming a member today of the English Speaking Union. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Thank you again and have a wonderful afternoon.